Welcome to AUSA's Army Matters podcast, focusing on what's important to the total Army community. Today's episode is brought to you by GEICO. This Military Appreciation Month, GEICO would like to thank all current and retired military personnel. As a member of AUSA, you could qualify for a special discount. It's GEICO's way of saying thanks for all you do.
Welcome to AUSA's Army Matters podcast. This is Thought Leaders with Joe Craig. My guest today is Jessica Donati, author of Eagle Down, The Last Special Forces Fighting the Forever War. Jessica Donati covers foreign affairs for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C., and has reported from over a dozen countries in the role. She joined the paper as the bureau chief in Kabul in 2015, and she lived in Afghanistan for over 4 years. Previously, she worked for Reuters in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, covering the conflicts in Libya and Afghanistan. She co-authored a series on the war in Libya that was chosen as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 2012. She's also the recipient of a New York Press Club Award for her reporting in Libya. Ms. Donati is British-Italian and grew up in Italy. She lives with her husband and son in Washington, D.C. Ms. Donati, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start with your own personal connection to the story that you cover in the book. What initially drew you to war reporting, and how did you end up in Afghanistan?
I fell into war reporting by accident. I was in London covering oil markets when the war in Libya broke out, and having my background in Italy, I was really familiar with the way that the Libyan conflict was playing out, and I ended up going over there for Reuters, and the experience of covering the civil war there really changed my life. I began to see everything in a lot more color. When you first are exposed to war, you see the absolute best and worst of humanity. And for me, after that, it was really difficult to go back to my desk job in London. And so I volunteered for Iraq. And Reuters said, we don't need anybody in Iraq, but you can go to Afghanistan instead. And I think my reaction at that point, this was in 2011, was, well, the war in Afghanistan is still going on. And that's the kind of knowledge that I had before I set off.
You then go on to start with the book, which Eagle Down starts in 2015. It's after most U.S. forces had left Afghanistan. So could you give some background to our listeners and set the stage for the new phase of the war?
So when I first got there, there was this rapid drawdown of tens of thousands of forces. And the messaging that was coming out of Washington was that the war was over, combat operations were over, and it was now just a training and advisory mission. For those of us who were in Afghanistan living there day to day, it was pretty clear that the Afghan forces were not ready to stand alone and that the US would either have to escalate their involvement or allow parts of the country to fall. And so what we saw in 2015 was the Taliban started to press on some of the major cities where they had influence, and that forced the US to get back involved. But there wasn't a simultaneous change in messaging from Washington. The government continued to maintain that the war was over and this was just training, even as its soldiers were frequently back in combat.
You talk about how the nature of the mission changed to training and advisory. One of the main themes I find in the book is that need for clarity of mission. And one of the people you profile, Major Michael Hutchinson, we call him Hutch throughout the book, he had a plan to recapture the city of Kunduz. He submitted a plan under the NATO training mission, but it was actually approved under a different mission and had different rules of engagement. Could you explain that for our listeners?
So the U.S. had these two separate missions. They had the training and advisory mission, and they had the counterterrorism mission, which supposedly was just to continue to target al-Qaeda. In practice, all troops there could be deployed under one mission or the other. The difference was the flexibility and the kind of rules that were allowed. So by approving his mission under the counterterrorism rules, he had more flexibility in airstrikes and other things. This was never really articulated to the soldiers, much less to the public. The way that it was presented to the media was that these two missions were separate and that the roles of forces were separate. But in fact, it wasn't. They were used interchangeably just to give the military more flexibility on the battlefield.
You talk about different rules, and with the counterterrorism mission, especially how it relates to airstrikes. And during that mission in Kunduz, there was actually a tragic mistake where an airstrike was called in a hospital. Could you talk about how that actually happened and the effect it had on the war?
The strike on the hospital, one of the problems was that the U.S. changed its story multiple times, which has created a lot of suspicion about what really happened. Another factor that contributed to the misunderstandings that surrounded the strike were that the U.S. had never really stated that they were continuing to provide air support for Afghan forces. And so it wasn't understood how this came about. The way that events unfolded was that the Afghan commandos that night decided that they had two targets that they wanted to hit. They gave the GPS coordinates to the Special Forces soldiers, and then they went out. Back at the command center, when they heard that they had requested air support, they were able legally to call in an airstrike because of certain approvals that allowed the U.S. to carry out airstrike for Afghan forces that were defending U.S. forces. The coordinates that were given to the aircraft did not match the hospital. They plotted to an empty field because of problems with the gunship. And so the crew aboard the gunship visually identified the target and through a series of misunderstandings ended up carrying out the airstrike on what they believed was the target that the Afghans planned to hit. This resulted in the destruction of the hospital and the deaths of at least 42 people, an inquiry, the suspension of many of the soldiers involved, and it generally gave the U.S. a very bad image, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world. And there was talk of war crimes. And of course, the investigation that followed, the full results were never released. And so they're still redacted. That leaves many people wondering what really happened. And people still suspect that the strike on the hospital was carried out on purpose. The other problem with the whole event was that the Afghan commanders were well known to dislike the hospital because the MSF had a policy whereby they would treat both the Taliban, Afghan government, all people equally. And the Afghan government didn't like the hospital for this. And so they had previously raided the hospital looking for Taliban commanders. The description of the target that the Afghan commanders had given the Americans that night matched the hospital. So there are a lot of questions over whether the Afghan dislike of the hospital contributed to the mistake.
Well, I'd like to follow up a little more on connections with the Afghan commandos. Certainly, this tragedy had a natural effect on future operations. And you go on to describe a mission that comes a little later where U.S. Special Forces and Afghan commandos are in a valley. They're supposed to clear some Taliban positions, but the U.S. team had to stop shooting and air support was denied. The Afghan commando leader obviously was not particularly happy about this. Can you talk about how this type of interaction affected relations between the two?
This was a problem that started at the beginning of 2015 and has really continued up until present day. The fact is that the U.S. provides only limited support to Afghan forces, and after the strike on the hospital, that support was even more restricted. The logic from the government side, where policy made in Washington, was that by restricting air support and other forms of support, you forced the Afghans to do the work themselves. In practice on the battlefield, this was completely unrealistic because the Afghans didn't have the means to achieve these things. And so from the Afghans' perspective and from the Special Forces perspective, it was a case of the U.S. not being committed enough to the war to really want the Afghans to win. So this created a huge amount of suspicion amongst Afghan security forces that America wanted the country to be like that and that they were deliberately making it a mess because they did have the air capacity available, but they didn't want to use it. It was very damaging.
Right. And speaking of damaging, I mean, you report other instances in the book of insider attacks. Can you tell us how prevalent they were and the effects they had between the relations?
Yeah, insider attacks really ballooned in 2012, just when I had started in Afghanistan, and they caused the U.S. to scale back their engagement. This was also very damaging because it meant that U.S. and Afghan soldiers couldn't spend as much time together, that any sort of interaction involved having heavily armed American soldiers pointing their guns at the VIPs just in case something went wrong. As these attacks continued, the amount of interaction scaled back. You look at how it impacted special forces back in the earlier years of the war during the village stability operations, for example. American and Afghan soldiers ate together, they rode together, they patrolled together. Things were much more relaxed. If you fast forward to, say, 2016, 2017, they barely interacted. You would have maybe meetings between the more senior people on the teams, but you wouldn't have that day-to-day interaction between the soldiers. And that obviously created problems when they went out on missions together, and it really impacted their ability to be effective.
Hey everyone, we hope you're enjoying the show. We'd like to take a moment to thank GEICO for making this episode possible. This Military Appreciation Month, GEICO would like to thank all current and retired military personnel. As a member of AUSA, you could qualify for a special discount. It's GEICO's way of saying, thanks for all you do.
In the book, one of the other soldiers that you profile among the many is Caleb Brewer. Can you tell us about Caleb Brewer and what happened to him in Sangin?
He was on his first deployment as a Green Beret, and he'd been deployed before to Iraq when he was in the conventional army. And I thought he was an interesting character because he was very cerebral. He had a very philosophical approach. One of the questions that I always had was, how do these soldiers cope with what seems to be often a hopeless situation when you're deploying to a war where the policy makes it very difficult to be successful, where there's a continuous decline in security? How do you keep your morale up? And from Caleb's perspective, he saw himself as going there to do a sort of specific job, and he was going to go and make life better for the group of people that he was working with. What happened to him was he was part of a team that was put in Helmand when there was a shift in the stance that the US had. After the Obama administration decided to delay the withdrawal of troops, they became much more offensive, especially in the South, where there were starting to be pretty concerning losses to the Taliban. And so the teams, including Caleb's team, were being pushed out onto these operations without having the proper support. Often they had difficult access to medevac. They encountered all sorts of really basic problems like vehicles that didn't work. They didn't have enough generators, things that really most people would never imagine that Green Berets out in the field would be lacking. So what happened to him, unfortunately, was that during one of these missions in Sangin, he was involved in a clearing operation, and he ended up stepping on an IED and becoming a double amputee.
Yeah, and then you go on to talk about his recovery process at home, detailing the support that his wife gives him during the process. I mean, that's another remarkable part about the book, is that you're not just covering the soldiers in Afghanistan. There's an earlier vignette where you're talking about Hutch's daughter, who actually sees her father on television in the middle of combat operations during Kunduz. Can you give us a little bit more about what it's like for the families at home?
For me, it was a really important part of the story because one of the challenges that I always had as a journalist in Afghanistan was making people care about the story, about the war. I mean, it was a war that had been going on for almost 20 years by that point. And I thought that the best way to make readers really understand what was being asked of soldiers deployed there and what was being sacrificed was to show that sort of intimacy and what level family members suffer and the impact that it has on kids, on wives. And that was why I included it in the book. The pressure that the families back home are under is extraordinary because they have very limited access to information about what their partners are doing. They live in constant fear that something could happen to them and that they wouldn't make it back. They have to explain to their children what their parents are doing. And for example, in the case of Hutch, the incident in Kunduz is going to be something that they're going to have to talk about with the kids at some point. So all of these things I hoped would bring the reality of the war to life and make people care.
And speaking of Hutch, Hutch is ultimately reinstated and returns to Afghanistan after the Army investigation. At that point, there's a new administration, a new commander in country. How had the overall mission changed?
The Trump administration came in once McMaster took over. They had the idea that they were going to ramp up pressure on the Taliban and basically turn the tide of the war and force them into negotiating more genuinely at the table. The problem was that while McMaster was totally bought into this policy, President Trump was not. And he was a longtime skeptic of the war. And everybody involved in Afghanistan at that point was worried that he would see something on Fox News and decide to pull the plug and pull everyone out. The fact that there was clearly no long-term commitment to this strategy because Trump had made it so clear that he wanted to get out meant that this ramp-up just led to an escalation in violence and not much change in the battlefield because at the end of the day, even sending a few thousand troops over, this big increase in airstrikes, you were still not going to turn the tide of the war with the Taliban increasing their influence in rural areas and edging in on cities. What you see now, after the deal was signed, the Taliban have been consolidating positions around major cities, and the big concern is that they will attack once the May 1st deadline passes, or if they feel like the US is showing signs of not leaving, and they're in a position of being able to overrun multiple provincial capitals the way that Kunduz fell, which is why that first battle in Kunduz, as described in the book, is really important because it was the first time that the Taliban had captured a city, and it also provided the blueprint for the US to regain those cities without these long, protracted battles that you were seeing in Iraq. The battle in Kunduz was relatively short. If it hadn't been for the disaster at MSF, it would have been viewed as a success. The fact was that within a couple of weeks, the government was pretty much back installed and the city was more or less intact.
As you mentioned, you conclude the book with the U.S. signing the deal with the Taliban. The U.S. can withdraw troops. The Taliban is supposed to engage with the Afghan government and secure a peace. What do you think, based on your experience, what's going to happen when the last U.S. troops come home this fall?
This is the million-dollar question that everybody's asking. I mean, the best possible outcome that anyone could hope for would be that the Afghans all come together and realize that it is in no one's best interest to have a protracted civil war and nobody in power, and that this leads them to overcome their differences and figure out a way to share power. I think the more likely outcome is going to be that each side is going to once again test itself on the battlefield. The Taliban may try to gain the upper hand to improve their position. They are ready to take over a number of cities, so this could give them more leverage. And so my concern would be a much worse civil war with an outpouring of refugees and huge numbers of casualties until they've exhausted both possibilities. What I don't think is likely is that you would see the Taliban roll into Kabul and seize power straight away. The Afghan army, even though it's hugely troubled, there is a core of really highly trained, highly equipped, highly motivated fighters who will stick around. And even if they're not specifically loyal to Ghani, the president, they'll have other loyalties in the government. And so I think that the civil war outcome, unfortunately, seems to be the more likely option. You've heard U.S. leaders say that they're going to continue to try to exert diplomatic leverage by threatening to withdraw recognition from the Taliban or withholding development aid or removing them from the sanctions list. These could all be incentives to get the Taliban not to try to consolidate itself on the battlefield. But I don't know whether those would be enough. I think it's really a bit of a long shot.
Well, should that civil war come to pass, just wondering personally, and I know you've been in D.C. reporting on foreign policy for a few years, do you think you would ever go back to country to report on a civil war like that?
Having spent such a long time in Afghanistan and visiting in and out, and I got a lot of friends there. And, when I first got to the country, I really didn't know anything. And I've, over the years, become really attached. And so I do feel strongly about the need to have continued good coverage of what happens and to ensure that the world doesn't forget about the civil war just because all of the Westerners have gone. But as you know, I've got a baby at home, and so I think my husband will kill me if I go off to Afghanistan anytime soon, although the journal has been looking for volunteers. So I'm thinking I will go later in the year when the baby is a bit older for a short trip. But until he's a lot older, I don't think that I can do that kind of reporting.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, it puts an amazing perspective on the sacrifices that the soldiers make when they have to leave babies, children, loved ones back at home.
I was already in awe of the wives and girlfriends back home, of how they managed to keep the household running, looking after small kids and with pregnancies, all the while with their husbands in these dangerous positions. And I just couldn't imagine doing it at all.
Well, we certainly appreciate the efforts you made to give us information about the course of the war for the last 5 years. And I want to thank you also for being our guest today. Ms. Donati's new book is Eagle Down, The Last Special Forces Fighting the Forever War. So again, Ms. Donati, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
To all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Army Matters podcast on iTunes and everywhere podcasts are found. The Army Matters podcast series is brought to you by the Association of the United States Army, the U.S. Army's professional association, member-supported, Army-connected. Visit us at AUSA.org for more information or to become a member. Your membership helps AUSA continue to carry out its mission to educate, inform, and connect with the total Army, our industry partners, and our supporters of a strong national defense. For questions or to provide topic recommendations, email us at podcast@ausa.org. Have a great Army Day. Hua.